On the 7th of February 1788, the Union Jack was placed into the sandy soils of Sydney Cove, marking this small piece of Australia for the British Empire. It was quite a small ceremony, only attended by Governor Philip himself, as well as a small contingent of armed men that had accompanied the First Fleet. This small, intimate ceremony would go on to have large, wide impacts across not only the Sydney area, but the wider Australian continent. Most notably for the people that already lived in the continent for well over 50,000 years, for they would have the biggest detriment as a result of this small ceremony and the wide expansion of British influence in Australia. So today I'm going to look at the first 5 years of this brand new colony and how the colonists adapted to being in such an isolated part of the world. But also I'm going to look at the local clans and the peoples that were already in Australia and how they dealt with this brand new colony for the first 5 years. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all. From those down the road to the folks around the world. There's no need for me to tell you what I'm doing because I've already done it. So run VT. Just a few days before arriving in Port Jackson, the British spied a couple of French vessels out in the distance. Could this be a compromising moment where the French are about to attack and set this age-old rivalry all the way across to the Pacific? Well, it turns out that no, that wasn't the case. These two vessels were exploratory vessels, headed by Jean-François de Galaup, the Comte de La Pérouse. The man simply and often referred to as La Pérouse. He and his two crews had set sail from France in 1785, making exploratory visits to Chile, to Alaska, to the Solomon Islands, and various areas throughout the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. The British would invite La Pérouse over to their brand new colony soon after they had just landed. The British would offer their assistance to the French and vice versa. Now, Commodore Philip never actually met his French counterpart, probably because he was more focused on constructing a brand new colony. And La Pérouse was more engaged with the scientific explorations of this brand new continent than he was with whatever the British were doing. But that didn't mean that they were completely isolated from one another. French and British officers met roughly about a dozen or so times, again for assistance purposes with water and wood or general supplies for each other. La Pérouse would stay within the Port Jackson and Botany Bay area until about the 6th of March, making geological surveys and general observations of this brand new continent. He would then head north towards what is now Canada and was roughly estimating to be back in France in June of 1789. But neither one of his two ships made it back, completely shipwrecked and lost to the seas of the Pacific Ocean. But historians are still able to chronicle the great voyage made by La Pérouse, because La Pérouse was very clever when he arrived at Port Jackson. He handed his journals and diaries over to the British, believing that they would get back to Europe, back to France, quicker than he would going in the other direction, because he had still a lot of exploring to do. So on the 14th of July, 1788, the first fleet ship Alexander carried the papers of La Pérouse back to bonny old England, in the company of the Friendship, the Prince of Wales, and the Barrowdale. Now the Barrowdale and the Prince of Wales managed to split up from the main group and get ahead, arriving in England on the 25th of March 1789. The Friendship had to be scuttled, so all of the crew had to be then processed onto the Alexander, which eventually arrived back in bonny old England on the 1st of June 1789. nearly 11 months after leaving Port Jackson. Many of the other ships from the First Fleet didn't stay in Port Jackson very long either. The Lady Penrhyn, the Charlotte and the Scarborough left Port Jackson on the 5th and 6th of May 1788. The three ships ended up in China on the 9th of September 1788 and due to make a tea run for the East India Company. Asking the Lady Penrhyn was going to be difficult. Her crew were very, very ill and the whole thing had to be abandoned. She left and turned back to England, arriving in the August of 1789. Asking Charlotte was quite easy, but very slow. She got to China, picked up the tea, but didn't arrive back in England until 24th of November 1789. Asking the crew of the Scarborough was eventful. The crew were lacking provisions, they were suffering from scurvy, and even had to make minor repairs, and didn't leave China until December of 1788. But they arrived back in England with the tea, ready on the go, by April of 1789. So if you want your tea, go ask the crew of the Scarborough. The Golden Grove and the Fishburne were the last two ships to leave Port Jackson on the 19th of November 1788. Now the Golden Grove had to stop in the Falkland Islands just off of Argentina for a few days because its crew was suffering from scurvy and they didn't want to risk any loss of life because of this illness. The Fishburne went on ahead and arrived in England on the 25th of April 1789. Eventually the Golden Grove arrived at their home destination on the 9th of June. A satellite colony created for commercial development on what is now called Norfolk Island, named after the Duchess of Norfolk, was founded on the 6th of March 1788, and for the next 2 years it would be supplied and resourced by the HMS Sirius and the HMS Supply. At the actual colony itself, Commodore Phillips upgraded himself to Governor Phillips, marking him as the new leader of this brand new colony. He'd led the First Fleet, why not this new colony as well? He placed his canvas tent, his office if you will, on what was to be the Tank Stream, now this lovely fountain on the Rocks Ferry Terminal. He would also use this stream that led out into the wider ocean as the dividing point between the western government sections, where a new government house was being built, where the botanical gardens are now, but what was the agricultural centres, and then on the eastern side was where all the convicts were, where the hospitals were being built, where the makeshift sort of tents were, and where some of the earliest of the defensive systems at Sydney Cove were being developed. Now I mentioned in my previous video that Governor Phillips had moved the entire colony from Botany Bay to Port Jackson because he had deemed it a more suitable area for the colony, not least for its soil quality. But over the next few months to a year after setting up this new colony, it was becoming very apparent that actually this soil wasn't very good at all. The seeds were being sown, they were germinating okay, but in the heat of the Australian summer, they were just withering and dying. And those that did survive the heat were being eaten by the local wildlife. So things became very desperate by the later months of 1788. So Governor Phillips had to think very fast yet again in this time of desperation. He had 4 plans. Well, 3 plans and one fingers crossed, hope to die kind of an option. The first plan was to go 20 kilometres upstream via one of the local rivers to a place he would call Rose Hill, set up a new agricultural base and hope that a wheat crop would grow quite efficiently. Thankfully, by 1789, the first wheat crop was in bloom and it's the first wheat crop noted on Australian soil. The second plan was also quite simple as well. Send the HMS Sirius over to South Africa, get them to pick up some supplies and return back to Port Jackson. On the 2nd of October 1788, that's when the HMS Sirius left, and it didn't come back to Port Jackson until about 7 months later. Now this brings me on to Governor Philip's third idea, this third plan. With the crops failing and food in a very limited quantity, Governor Phillips was in a very desperate situation and conceived a very poor plan that is one probably out of pure desperation. He wanted to turn to the local resources, the natural resources in Australia. So Governor Phillips needed local knowledge, but the clanspeople from the Port Jackson and surrounding areas were not interested in interacting with their brand new self-imposed neighbours from Europe. So on New Year's Eve 1788, Governor Philip took the drastic action to kidnap one of the locals by the name of Arabanu and basically force diplomatic ties between the European colonists and the locals in the area. Unfortunately, the disease known as smallpox was brought to Australia via the colonists. Arabanu caught this disease and died in captivity. So he tried again. Governor Phillips then captured two men by the name of Benelong and Kolebi. The two men were captured towards the end of November 1789 and detained at the brand new Governor House, which was in the process of being built at the time. Kolebi managed to escape within a few weeks of being captured, but Benelong stayed for roughly 6 months. During that 6-month period, Benelong managed to get on quite well with his European captures. He mastered English quite well, and he was well liked. And in some accounts, Governor Phillips and Benelong would refer to each other in the local language as father and son. Now, the seemingly positive relationship between Benelong and his captors was marked by the naming of Benelong Point, which is where the Sydney Opera House stands today, but where a small little residence was constructed for Benelong during the early 1790s. Now, I may have painted a rather positive picture between Benelong and his colonist captors, but it remains to be said that he was kidnapped by his European counterparts, and the interactions between the colonists and other local Australians would go on to have dire consequences on the part of the locals that had lived there for thousands and thousands of years. Now, the first fleet and the colonists on board brought over the disease known as smallpox, and when they began to interact with the local Australian clans, forcibly I should say, they passed on this disease to the local clans. This became a widespread epidemic amongst the local Australians, which killed between 50 and 90% of the populations in the surrounding areas. And then when the colonists began to understand the resources that were available to them in the Australian landscape, they began to strip and callously decimate a lot of the natural landscape. They were in a desperate position, so they were taking it away. But they were taking it away from the local Australian clans who had needed that for themselves, and so putting them in an equally desperate situation as the colonists themselves. So you can understand why, by the end of the 1790s, a lot of the remaining local Australians in the surrounding areas of Port Jackson formed together to create new groups and then moved away from the smallpox, move away from the decimation that had been caused by the colonists themselves, and move away from a desperate situation that was becoming in this local area. Now, in early 1791, the feelings of the local Australian clanspeople were made very clear to the colonists. Benelong organised a sacred ceremony known as a corroboree and invited Governor Phillips and a few of the colonists over to Manly, which is just across the water from where Sydney is situated. It is also the site where Benelong was kidnapped in November of 1789. Gifts were exchanged and friendly conversations between the two parties were had. But at a vital moment within this engagement, Governor Phillips was speared in the shoulder. Now, in any European setting, this would perhaps be deemed as a senseless act of violence, or perhaps a declaration of war. But being what this was, this significant event, it was kind of a ritualistic payback. Now, as the most senior member of the colonial party, it was seen that Governor Phillips was the one responsible for the kidnap, the violence, and the taking of the land of Port Jackson away from the local people of Australia. And it's considered not to be a declaration of war because the spear that struck Governor Phillips was not serrated, and it was not deliberately targeted in an area close to the vital organs. Now, in response to this spearing and this event itself, Governor Phillips didn't want to retaliate. He understood and, well, probably realised that the local Australians were none too happy with the colonialist presence in Australia. Now, the fourth idea, which was the fingers crossed kind of moment for Governor Phillips, was the anticipation that a second fleet of British ships was going to arrive at Port Jackson at some point in 1790. There were 6 ships in this second fleet bound for Australia. The first, the Lady Juliana, left Portsmouth on the 29th of July 1789. The Guardian, the second ship, left on the 12th of September 1789, but never made it to the Australian coastline, being shipwrecked just off the coast of South Africa. The other 4 ships, the Justinian, the Surprise, the Neptune, and the Scarborough, one of the main characters from the first fleet, all left as a group together on the 10th of January 1790. The second fleet is considered to be a nautical disaster by standards previously set within the first fleet. Now, the Guardian had been the ship that carried all of the plants, all of the machinery, all of the livestock, and the seeds that would help this brand new fledgling colony. It arrived in South Africa on the 24th of November 1789 and left exactly 1 month later. But just a day or two later, the ship hit an iceberg whilst it was collecting water for its own supplies. With the water rising, most of the crew and convicts left the ship, abandoned it, and it was then slowly dragged back to South Africa and beached, never to be used again. Now, the other 5 ships, despite not being wrecked or anything such like, they weren't exactly the beacons of brilliance like the first fleet had been. Now, the ship Neptune was probably the worst ship to be on during this second fleet. A third of its convict contingent, roughly about 160 of them, were killed by the various diseases that were endemic across the entire ship. And half of those convicts, 270 or so, were completely fatigued and ill by the time they arrived in Australia. Rations aboard the Neptune were pitiful at best. The punishments by the crew towards the convict were harsh, probably the harshest amongst the fleet, if not the entire convict sort of era. And most of the convicts spent a lot of their time below decks, chained up for the entire voyage that they spent. Now, the Surprise was a teeny tiny little ship compared to the rest of its major counterparts, not designed for big long voyages to Australia. Even in the calmest of weather, the Surprise would rock and sway and be buoyed by the giant waves, as such, of the 7 seas. Now, the Surprise actually separated from the main group, probably because of this bad weather that it was experiencing, but it still made good time, arriving roughly around the same time in mid-June that the rest of the ships did. Roughly 15% of the Surprise's convict contingent were already dead by the time they arrived in Australia, and 45% were ill and fatigued arriving in Australia. Now, the Scarborough and the Justinian, part of that main group, had sort of the same kind of stories as the other ships. Perhaps not as harsh as the Neptune, and not as unsteady as the Surprise. And of course, it did actually make it to Australia, unlike the Guardian. But still, the convicts suffered greatly during this voyage. Now finally, the Lady Juliana was the first ship to leave England and the first to arrive at Port Jackson. That seems a rather obvious statement, perhaps. But the Lady Juliana left 6 months before any of its other counterparts did, but only arrived 3 weeks ahead of the main group. The Lady Juliana's voyage is recorded as the slowest in convict history. It took 11 months to get from England all the way to Port Jackson. It stopped at the usual destinations of Tenerife, Santiago, Rio de Janeiro and Cape Town, but it spent quite a long time there, roughly about 2 to 2.5 months, just at these various stops in total. But despite being quite a slow journey, it was a much better journey than the rest of the Second Fleet, and can probably be summed up by this one quote from one of the stewards serving aboard the vessel. "We arrived here safe after a long voyage, in very good health, as we had everything that we could expect from them, and all our provisions were good." The convicts were given fresh food at every port. The rations were evenly distributed and in the correct quantities. The ships were kept clean and in a good condition. And all of the convicts, they weren't chained down in the bottom hulk of the main ship. They were allowed to freely move about on the top deck and in the bowels of the ship as well. However, there was a lack of discipline, perhaps, by the captain of the ship and the main officers on board. And the ship was compared to a floating brothel. The thing is, all of the convicts on board, all 226 of them, were prostitutes from London. The Lady Juliana arrived at Port Jackson on the 3rd of June, 1790, with the rest of the ships arriving between the 20th and the 28th of June, 1790. But Governor Phillips was not happy with what came to Port Jackson in the colony. Now, the store ship Guardian had been wrecked off the coast of South Africa, so no resources or proper resources could be given to this new colony. A fifth of the convict contingent had already died on the voyage, and well over a third were in a pretty poor state and had to use the meagre hospital facilities that were available at Port Jackson. But still, there were 1,000 convicts, ill or not, that needed to be fed and watered in this brand new Port Jackson colony. And that's 1,000 more than Governor Phillips could already cope with. By 1790, the governor and the colony itself were in a desperate situation, still on the brink of starvation and just total collapse. So the Second Fleet was not helping at all. Okay, right, let's just take stock of the situation for a moment. There's 1,000 new colonists arriving at Port Jackson. You've set up an agricultural hub up at Rose Hill, but you're probably going to have to expand that now because you have that many more colonists. You've sent the HMS Sirius to South Africa and it's brought you back some supplies. But that was a year ago, and those resources are probably dwindling quite low by the June of 1790. But thankfully you've sort of planned ahead without even realising it. On the 19th of April 1790, Governor Phillips sent out the HMS Supply to the Dutch East Indies to bring back more resources for the colony at Port Jackson. Now, of course, these resources wouldn't arrive back at Port Jackson until the 19th of September 1790. But it wasn't just the supply that was bringing the resources. A Dutch ship was borrowed, known as the Waxamhyde. It's probably a very poor pronunciation, and here's the proper spelling. Seeing these 2 full ships must have sent Governor Phillips into a fit of enthusiasm for this brand new colony. A lucky moment, considering that just 3 months before had been quite unlucky, as 1,000 colonists disembarked from the Second Fleet. But the luck wouldn't really last too long. Governor Phillips anticipated that a 3rd fleet of ships was going to arrive at some point in 1791. 11 ships left from England and Ireland and bound for Australia. Most of them left on the 27th of March, 1791. and would arrive somewhere between the 9th of July and the 16th of October that same year. Now, the Third Fleet managed to have a much fairer experience, both in travel capability and in death rates, compared to that of the Second Fleet. Although the Second Fleet was a complete disaster and is unlike anything before or since. They also didn't have a lot of resources on board either. Well, no, that's a lie. They had enough resources on board, but they just weren't for the Port Jackson colony. Most of the ships transporting the convicts and transporting the resources were East India Company trading ships who were due to make stops at Portuguese settlements in India and give all of the iron, the copper, the lead, and all of the commodities and resources for those colonies instead of the Port Jackson colony. So Governor Phillips has to write yet another angry letter of complaint to the commissioners out in Britain saying, what are you doing? You had an opportunity to send 11 ships to Port Jackson, fully resourced, fully committed to this colony, to this idea, and you're hiring East India trading vessels who are going to India for Portuguese settlements. You need a fleet that is dedicated to this cause. Or words to that effect. Most of the ships from the Second and Third Fleet wouldn't exactly linger too long in the Port Jackson area. Most of them would stay for a couple of months or so and then move off for more trading prospects. Some towards China for tea runs, some towards India for what I previously mentioned, and then others, especially in the Third Fleet, were whaling vessels as well. So they would head off into either Asiatic areas or towards Peru and Chile. Now, the HMS Supply, which had serviced the colony since its beginning days, would leave Australia bound for England on the 16th of November 1791, arriving back in bonny old England on the 21st of February 92. But the colony wasn't completely left unattended. On the 26th of October 1792, the Third Fleet ship Atlantic was sent by Governor Phillips to Bengal on another resources run, like had been done by the Supply in 1790 and the Sirius back in 1788-89. It returned back from its resources run to Bengal on the 20th of June 1792. Now, coming to the end of the first 5 years of this Port Jackson colony, many of the Marines and the soldiers that had been part of the First Fleet were now due to head back to England. On the 18th of December 1791, the HMS Gorgon, which had served with the Third Fleet, took back the first contingent of soldiers and Marines back to England. It would arrive back in England on the 20th of June 1792. 6 months after its resources run, the Atlantic set sail for England on the 11th of December 1792. It carried with it the remaining soldiers and Marines from the First Fleet, but also Governor Phillips, who was in a poor state of health, as well as the man called Bennelong. Bennelong's wife, Barangaroo, was not happy when she found out that her husband was heading off to England. Her first husband and family had died of smallpox about a year or two before. She hated the thought of the Europeans flogging each other as a form of punishment. She was a very determined lady and a very strong-willed character, but she wouldn't see her husband until 1794. Sydney would not have a governor between December of 1792 and September of 1795. During that period, it was under a sort of military rule. Now, the man who would take over as governor was a man called John Hunter, and he had served aboard one of the First Fleet vessels all those years ago. But the colony itself would not go on to be self-sufficient until 1804. And that, I think, is where I shall end this video. I apologise if this is slightly longer than last week's video, but there's a lot going on in this first 5-year period. So I suppose it needed to be perhaps a little bit stretched and elongated. I still hope that you have enjoyed it and you've learned quite a lot and understood perhaps this period that not many people may necessarily know about. So until then, I shall see you all next week. Ta-ta for now. you.